Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer. I'm your host, Matt Keim, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. I'm here to talk about all the top games this weekend, but one in particular caught my eye. And today we're going down to Austin, Texas to see the TCU Horned Frogs take on the Texas Longhorns. Now, what's at stake for TCU? They're 9-0 for the first time since they sent a team to the Rose Bowl in 2011. And if they win this game, they cement a spot in the Big 12 championship. Granted, if they lose this game, they still have two other games after this to clinch their spot. They're probably all but locked in anyways. But this is certainly, you could make the argument that this is certainly their toughest remaining test. And on Texas's side, they're still trying to even out what has been a season that is kind of defined by the Quinn Ewers injury. With Texas, it's really, really hard to look at this team, even though they're 6-3, they're sitting at 18. The way that they've looked with Quinn Ewers for the vast majority of the season sans the ending of the Oklahoma State game. What happens with this Texas team if Quinn Ewers does not get hurt against Alabama? I personally am of the opinion that they beat Alabama if he stays healthy. Do they still lose to Texas Tech? Probably not. They probably still do drop a game somewhere because he was perfectly healthy in the Oklahoma State loss, so there's no excuse for that one. But it really is a season of what-ifs as far as Texas is concerned. Another thing about Texas's season is that multiple of their games, including that Oklahoma State loss, involved blown double-digit leads. So they lost a lead to Kansas State, even though they won that game. They had a 14-point lead and lost it. They lost a double-digit lead they blew a double-digit lead in the process of losing to Oklahoma State. They were up by Alabama by 10 and I think 13 at points in those games, and they have lost games in which they've led by at least 14 points 4 times in the past 2 years, which has kind of become like a pattern under Steve Sarkisian. Now, granted, first year they're rebuilding, second year they're dealing with injuries and a relatively young roster, so extenuating circumstances perhaps, but it is one of the more relevant trends, especially when we get to the TCU portion of this video. I don't think it could be argued that this team is not on the right track. They bounced back very nicely against Kansas State last week after a demoralizing loss to Oklahoma State, and even though they're not going to be anywhere near the New Year's Six unless they win the Big 12, they're not exactly a normal 6-3 team, is what I'm trying to get at. Beyond Quinn Ewers, they have one of the best running backs in the country in Bijan Robinson. He's rushed for over 1,100 yards, and so this is going to be a good game and going to be a good showcase for Bijan. Another factor about this game is that Texas surprisingly has not beaten a top 5 team in Austin since 1999. Which is just kind of a stunning stat, and then you remember that every time they play Oklahoma, who would probably be their most consistent top 5 ranked opponent, that game's always in a neutral site, so yeah. But despite some growing pains, I would argue that Texas is very much on the right track, but we probably won't see it really start to pay off until next year. So the ironic thing about TCU being in this game is that Gary Patterson, their longtime former head coach, is actually on Texas's staff as the defensive coach. And so it would be like the bitterest of ironies if Gary Patterson, of all people, stopped TCU's undefeated season. One of the more relevant trends with TCU this year so far is that they have had a tendency to get behind in games. They've had to come back from behind against Kansas State. They had to do it against Oklahoma State. They had to... They've done it a few times, and one of the more troubling tendencies with TCU, if I'm a TCU fan, is that a lot of their big wins, they went through this stretch in October where they played 4 teams that were ranked at the time, all in a row, and it was kind of a murderer's row. And even though nobody in the Big 12 is kind of like elite, like the Georgia or the Ohio States or the Michigans of the world right now, it can't be argued that that conference isn't very deep. So just bear this in mind as I tear their schedule apart a little bit. In 4 consecutive games, they played Oklahoma, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State. And in only one of those games, the opponent's starting quarterback finished the game healthy. So Kansas State, Oklahoma, and Kansas all had their starting quarterbacks get hurt in that game. And in the Kansas State game, their second string quarterback was also playing hurt in that game. And so it's really hard to... I don't want to knock a team that's 9-0 at this point in the season too much, because there's only 3 other teams that are undefeated at this moment in time. But their non-conference schedule includes Tarleton and one of the worst Colorado teams in recent memory. On one hand, they have made it through not an easy schedule, but on the other hand, circumstances that are out of their control have made it smoother than it might otherwise have been. So one of the more troubling tendencies with TCU is their tendency to get behind even a little bit in games. Now, so far, they have come from behind to win all these games. They were down 18 to Kansas State at one point. They were down 17 to Oklahoma State. They were down to Kansas at one point. And it's just after a certain point, you're really playing with fire. Concern for TCU, because on one hand, we have a team that has a tendency to get ahead and then lose those leads. And on the other hand, you have a team that has a tendency to get behind and have to dig their way out of the hole. How many more times can TCU do that? How many more times can Texas do that? Another relevant stat is that there are 36 cases that I can count of. Maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong about this stat, in the comments, let me know. There are 36 games that were ranked versus ranked matchups at the time that those games were played. So not all of these teams are still ranked. The road team, I'm going to take out 2 quote-unquote neutral site games. Arkansas, Texas A&M, that game was in Dallas. And then Georgia and Oregon, that game was in Atlanta. If you take those two games out, the home team has a win-loss record of 24-10. I'm going to throw in at least the Georgia-Oregon game, so 25-10. The trends this year do not favor the road teams very much at all. So the road team has been at a pretty consistent disadvantage all year. And I know I'm invoking gambler's fallacy a little bit by even saying that as a trend, but I think it's worth pointing out that Alabama went to Austin and probably should have lost that game. Texas's first real loss with Quinn Ewers was in Stillwater. But how did TCU get to this point? They got here because Max Duggan, their quarterback, is playing like one of the best quarterbacks in America. He has while he's not the front runner for the Heisman, he's certainly in the mix to go to New York. And he's backed up by the second best running back in the Big 12 currently, Kendre Miller, who has a hair over 1,000 yards rushing this year. So they're coming with a very, very potent attack. They're ranked 4th in overall offense. It's just that their defense, when starting quarterbacks play against them, has not held up very well. And honestly, their defense has not been good. Kansas's backup put up big numbers against them. Kansas State's second stringer put up good numbers against them. I'd be stunned if Quinn Ewers doesn't have a good day. I can totally see a scenario where TCU is like down 10 late and then comes back and wins on a field goal or something. But as of right now, my official prediction, simply because I think Quinn Ewers' progression has been great this year, and he's certainly going to give TCU a run for their money. So I think Texas gets the win here. I still think TCU probably wins the conference, but Texas wins, they cover. That's going to open up a wild discussion for that 4th slot next Tuesday. Lightning round. There's other ranked games this week, and I want to talk to you about them. Alabama goes on the road yet again, and this time takes on Lane Kiffin and the Ole Miss Rebels. While I normally don't pick spreads for these games, I'm going to make an exception here. Alabama's favored by 12. Alabama has been terrible on the road all year, and Ole Miss is the type of team and the type of offense and the type of quarterback that has given this team a lot of problems all year. So I think Ole Miss very much can win this game. That said, I have a hard time seeing Nick Saban lose 2 games in a row. So I'll say Alabama wins, but Ole Miss covers. UCF at Tulane. I'm going to give the slightest of edges to Tulane here just because the game is in New Orleans, and so I think that favors Tulane quite a bit, so I think Tulane barely edges out UCF. Washington at Oregon. This will be a fun game because Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix have been playing amazing, and Bo Nix is responsible for 36 touchdowns this year, the most of any quarterback in FBS. The game's in Eugene. I think Oregon wins, and I think Bo Nix continues his ascent this year. Kansas State Baylor. Baylor has bounced back after a rough first month to the season, And Kansas State has been shaky in the last couple of weeks, coming on the heels of a couple of injuries and a couple of heartbreaking last-minute losses. While I have respect for both teams, I think Baylor takes the win here. Which brings us to our underrated game of the week. So I'm going to take North Carolina going on the road to face a fellow in-state rival, Wake Forest. So this is another one of those surprising games where the line actually favors an unranked team over a ranked team on a road. North Carolina is one of the surprises of the year simply because of how well their freshman quarterback Drake May has been playing. The man is an outsider. The man has an outside shot to go to New York, and North Carolina and Mac Brown. North Carolina is really good hands with Drake May and Mac Brown going forward, and they have a very, very reasonable shot to win the ACC this year. That said, they're playing against a Wake Forest team that has a really, really good offense and a really, really good quarterback in Sam Hartman. The last 2 weeks, they have committed 11 turnovers, including 8 second-half turnovers in a 4-touchdown loss against Louisville. I have a hard time respecting a team that gets blown out by Louisville, and even though Louisville's been playing better over the course of the last 6 or so weeks, it's just a little crazy to me that Wake Forest is favored by this much. So do you think those turnovers, so I guess the question is, are those turnovers a fluke? Are they indicative of a larger issue? What I do know is that this is going to be a tough game, once again, because it's on the road, and that I'm leaning North Carolina here because I really, really respect what Mac Brown has done this year. Keep an eye on this game. It'll be a shootout, and it'll be a good game, and it would not shock me at all to see an upset here. So I guess my technical prediction is North Carolina wins, but it wouldn't surprise me to see it go the other way. Well, that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thanks for sticking around. Remember to give us a like, comment, subscribe. Follow us on Ampire Media, AMPIRE Media. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the games.